Welcome to TrustTalk. Today's guest is Ian Shapiro, professor of political science at Yale University. Economics is at the heart of political trust. The disappearance of long-term employment security, less powerful labor unions, political party fragmentation and multi-party systems, and the inability of mainstream political parties to deliver enable fringe parties to mobilize fear, adding to mistrust. In his book, The Wolf at the Door, he argues that if business elites don't see that it is in their interest to get behind policies to restore economic inequalities, populist politicians are just a harbinger of things to come. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Professor, welcome to Trust Talk. You are a professor of political science at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. And during your tenure, your publications have focused on democracy, justice, and the methods of social inquiry. In what sense is trust a topic of interest to you?
Trust is a topic of interest to me because it is essential for the maintenance of democratic politics and institutions, and it supplies the basis for all cooperative activity that humans engage in.
So public trust in democratic processes seems to be seriously eroded by people in power who question election results. The latest example is Myanmar. But the US, long considered in the West to be a beacon of solid democracy, saw its election process under heavy stress. What impact does this have on trust in democracy?
Well, I would put the question the other way around. I think the question is why are these political leaders able to do that? We've known since Thomas Hobbes's time that the enemy of cooperation is fear and insecurity. So, Thomas Hobbes argued that people have a profound fear of death and a fear of being killed. Not surprising, he lived in the English Civil War, and it had the quality of what game theorists would subsequently refer to as a prisoner's dilemma, in that everybody's afraid that somebody else might kill them, so the natural thing to do is try and kill them first. And so that is the prisoner's dilemma Hobbes struggled with. But we've known since the 1980s with the work of people like Robert Axelrod that one of the central ways out of the prisoner's dilemma is to build trust. But it's easier said than done. And so in my own view, if you want to understand why there are such high levels of mistrust, the underlying question to ask is, why is there so much fear and insecurity in the world? That's what these politicians and political entrepreneurs are exploiting.
Mm-hmm. In a recent interview, a colleague of yours from UC Berkeley, Henry Brady, said, "I'm worried the Republic," and he meant, of course, the American Republic, "is as frayed as it's ever been since probably the mid-19th century, in the period just before, during, and after the Civil War." Are you as pessimistic?
Yes, I do think that the stress on American political institutions in the last 5 years is comparable to that period, the mid-19th century. Yeah.
So that doesn't sound very optimistic then.
Well, I think far too many people are focusing on the symptoms of the problem and not the problem itself. In my own view, the underlying problem is economic. It is the disappearance of long-term employment insecurity. It is the stagnation and decline of middle-class incomes. It is the downward mobility of many middle-class people. All of this creates fear that what was thought to be the American dream is no longer available. And again, what we know from behavioral psychology and behavioral economics is that when people expect or perceive that they're going to experience losses, this is a much more potent motivator of human action. I'm thinking of people like Kahneman and Tversky. This is a much more potent motivator of human action than the possibility of gains. And so I think the widespread expectation of losses is what these political entrepreneurs exploit. So I think that Trump was brilliant, even if it was blind, staggering luck, rather than, well thought out. But, make America great again is a slogan which carries the implication something has been taken away from you and I'm going to get it back.
I think that's a theme, right? You also have in your recent book, The Wolf at the Door. We're going to talk about it a little later. Before we go into that, many international surveys, like the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer, they reveal an epidemic of misinformation. I think they call it infodemic, and widespread mistrust of societal institutions and leaders around the world. How are you, as a political scientist, look at this?
Well, I think it is very, very wise to look at this as a much more global phenomenon and not just focus on the US, because many of these dynamics are going on elsewhere in the world. Much of my more recent work, again with Francis Rosenbluth, has focused on actually European countries where we've been looking at the growth, the increase in party fragmentation in multi-party systems. And, over the past 50 years, we've seen, particularly on the left, fragmentation of left parties. So, take the German example, but you could take many, many others. The SPD has been hemorrhaging support to the Linke, to the Greens, now to the AfD. And that is, again, I think related to economic factors. It is the failure of left of center parties to be able to protect their traditional constituencies. So this is reflected, as in the US, with the decline of industrial jobs, with globalization, with jobs going to technology. And so the traditional left of center parties are protecting shrinking labor aristocracies less well, because they're less powerful and they've got fewer members. And so the people they used to support are hemorrhaging to these fringe parties. And that is a story, all over although you could repeat that story for the Netherlands, you could repeat it for Austria, you could repeat it for France.
It's a global thing.
Yeah, and it's related, I think, to the decline of industrial jobs, the collapse of unions, and therefore the inability of the traditional social democratic mainstream parties to deliver the sorts of protections that they do. Traditionally did. And so you've got the same distrust, political entrepreneurs exploiting this insecurity as a way of getting paths to power.
Your former colleague Russell Hardin, in his contribution to Mark Warren's book Democracy and Trust, raised questions about the role of trust in a democracy on the ground of what he called mistaken inference and the complexities of modern governance. Can a citizen ever be knowledgeable enough to trust government responsibly, or is trust in government merely an exercise in self-deception?
Well, I think Russell was partly right, but I would put it a little differently. I tend to be a consequentialist about these matters. I agree completely that, the sort of deliberative democracy ideal that everybody's going to be a miniature policy wonk and we should have people understand public policy and so on. I think that is a fantasy, and it always has been. I think that Again, I would turn the question around and say, why is it that people mistrust political institutions and political parties? And the answer is that they have failed to deliver for those people. If we had continual growth of incomes, if we had, we've gone from a world in which 50 years ago, you finished your education, you got a job, you worked for a company for 30 years, and then you retired. People finishing their education now should expect to change jobs 12 to 15 times. That's fine if you're on the high end of the information revolution and you sort of hop through some startups and, build up a lot of individual wealth. But for most middle and lower middle class people, that's not what it is. It is bouncing down the socioeconomic scale into ever more insecure employment. Those are the people that see no reason to trust. It's the failure of the political system and the educational system and the economic system to deliver security that is breeding the mistrust. And the answer is not to wring our hands about how to get people more involved in political parties. The answer is to think about what kinds of policies would actually deliver things that would reduce their economic insecurity, and then they would start to have faith in the institutions that delivered those policies. So I tend to be a consequentialist about trust.
You just mentioned your colleague Francis McGall Rosenbluth.
Yeah.
In your book that you wrote with him, Responsible Parties, Saving Democracy from Itself, you write about political polarization. You argue, I think, that the transfer of political power to what you call the grassroots has eroded trust in politicians, in parties and democratic institutions, culminating in the rise of divisive populist politics. First of all, what caused the power to be transferred to the grassroots? And what are the grassroots?
So that's different in two-party systems and multi-party systems. In two-party systems, it is largely resulted from the weakening of parties. So in the American case, for instance, it's the interaction between safe seats and primaries, because we have an increasing number of safe seats over the last 6 decades, which means the only election that matters is the primary. But the truth about primaries is that only the political activists turn out in the primaries, and they're on the extremes of the parties. They're the political junkies, way to the left of the median Democratic voter in the Democratic side, and way to the right of the median Republican voter on the Republican side. But they select the candidates in the primaries, and so that pulls the parties apart. And then the people that they pick, for instance, find it very difficult to cooperate when they get elected, because if they do, they will get knocked off in the next primary. And so this is what enables hostile takeovers of weak parties in the US. It's a worse problem for the Republicans because they have many more safe seats.
Yeah, and that is what's causing the polarization?
That is a huge cause of the polarization, because it means that you get candidates selected who are on the extremes of the party. So Trump was selected as a presidential candidate by less than 5% of the U.S. electorate. You look at say, Adriana Ocasio-Cortez, who is in the 14th district in New York. She was picked by 11% in an 11% turnout in the 2018 primary. Or you look at these Tea Party people on the Republican side. They're picked by the activists on the extremes of the Republican Party in the primaries and caucuses, and the general election is irrelevant because it's a safe seat. So that is a big part. In the European systems, it's a different dynamic. It's the fragmentation, much more than the weak parties. So the failure, the inability of the mainstream parties to deliver enables, we've already really gone over this, enables fringe candidates and fringe parties to mobilize that fear and that anger and that distrust. And that's how you get polarization in those systems. So everybody's terrified of, the alternative for Deutschland, say in Germany, or the equivalent in Holland and Austria and so forth.
We talked about that in our interview a little earlier. Your newly published book, The Wolf at the Door, you wrote it with Michael Gratz, in a sense, follows up on your book in 2018. And it's more about economic insecurity, producing, among others, today's populism. Firstly, you are a political scientist, right? And not an economist. So I guess you are of the school of Adam Smith, the father of contemporary economic science, who learned us that the economy cannot be studied independently from sociological, political, and cultural factors.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. My co-author on the Responsible Parties, Frances, actually, she, not he, I should say. She's a political economist. That's part of the reason we work together. And Michael Gratz is a tax lawyer. He's spent in an earlier career, he was in the Treasury. I think our division of disciplines, certainly it didn't even exist when Adam Smith wrote. But you have to start with the problem and then take it where it leads you into economics, into behavioral psychology, into political economy.
Yeah. To address the economic insecurity you and Michael describe in The Wolf at the Door, policymakers should, according to your colleague, another colleague of yours, Francis Fukuyama, be able to create lasting solutions with a concerted effort to address the public's distrust of government efficacy and integrity. What is the recipe you advocate in your book?
Well, this book, The Wolf at the Door, is very much concerned not just with what would be good policies, although a lot of the book is about that, but how you might put together the coalitions to achieve those policies in practice. It's politics and policy together, because otherwise, what's the point in having great policies that are not going to be achieved? And what we argue, and this is a connection to what we were discussing earlier, is that unless business gets behind these policies, the prognosis is not good. This is in the U.S. case, for example. If you go back to the New Deal, in fact, there was somewhat surprising to many people, there was a considerable amount of business support for the New Deal. And the reason was, it was partly they were sort of proto-Keynesians, but it was also because the sort of Averell Harrimans of this world were looking at, very high levels of unemployment, economic desperation among American workers. There was a significant communist influence in the AFL-CIO. There was a competing model out there in the Soviet Union vying for the hearts and minds of American workers. And so the business, not all, but significant numbers of business elites thought, we better make sure that we don't get to a world where workers believe that they have nothing to lose but their chains. And that was partly why they supported things like Social Security, for example, and the other elements of the New Deal, significant numbers of elites. I think that, what Michael and I argue in The Wolf at the Door is that after the collapse of communism, there was a kind of complacency among the analogs of those people, because there was no longer, capitalism's the only game in town. You can move to the suburbs and build more prisons. These people, they're not important. And, what has been learned since 2016 is that complacency has come back to bite, because desperate people do desperate things, and desperate people can be mobilized by politicians who are actually going to do things that business is not going to like. They're going to, stop immigration. They're going to push for trade wars. They're going to push protectionism. They're going to, attack elites as corrupt. they're gonna mobilize people against the interests of business, and so is significant, and because labor is now so weak politically, the idea that organized labor is going to create pressure for these changes of the sort that was done in the New Deal and the Great Society in the U.S. with the creation of social democratic parties in Europe. Labor doesn't have the muscle, the political muscle, and so a big part of the audience for our book is business. That to get Tocqueville talked about self-interest rightly understood. To convince business elites that if they don't see that it's in their interest to get behind the sorts of policies we talk about for building middle-class wages, aggressive retraining of displaced workers, funded at a much, orders of magnitude bigger scale than exists in the U.S. If they don't do that, nobody should think Trump is an aberration. Trump is a harbinger of things to come. We talk about other ways of, it's important to put together coalitions and so forth, but a lot of the pressure has got to come from business. And I think similar things are true in Europe because the underlying challenges are the same.
Right. So to conclude our interview, Professor, what are, in your view, the greatest challenges for political scientists in trust for this decennium?
I think I think you have to think about it as a political economist, and I think coming up with policies that will erode the sources of mistrust, which have to do, I think, with the longer-term employment security, building a social wage, retraining programs. We talk about other things like health insurance, which is still not there for millions and millions of these people, and millions more who have it are going to lose it as they bounce down the socioeconomic scale. Those are the kinds of policies that are going to make a dent in the economic insecurity that is fueling the mistrust that is driving the populism and the extremist politics. So no, I don't want to be too much of a materialist about it, but I don't think it's rocket science. I think that is the core of the matter.
Thank you very much, Professor Shapiro. I've enjoyed listening to you, and thank you for your insights, and wish you all well.
You're most welcome.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Trust Talk. We would be very grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or on Stitcher. Don't miss out on future travels around trust, and subscribe to this channel or visit us on our website, trusttalk.co, or on Twitter @TrustTalkCO. We look forward to seeing you again.